Deportation Content by Andy Savana. Chapter 2. Not only did the protests not subdue the desire of the electorate to elect people who were enthusiastic supporters of increased deportations, it seemed to annoy people enough that they shifted even further on the issue, and not in a direction that benefited me, quite the opposite. In 2025, the president declared that the 14th Amendment didn't apply to people born in the country, to undocumented immigrants, or anyone residing without authorization in the country. No one seemed to care, and that was that. You would think at least a partial fight might have broken out, but it went smooth as butter, and the president's approval rating popped about 3 points. Once the midterms passed in 2026, a solid majority of both chambers of Congress were in place to pass the deportation resolution of 2026. This was bad. This is where the great deportation surge really got its legs. Why only focus on people with 2 illegal immigrants for parents? Why not those who had 1 parent that wasn't legal? You couldn't just halfway commit murder. You either did or you didn't. Why should immigration be different? With a vote in affirmation of the bill and a quick signature, the country entered a new era. Right about then is where I regretted never voting. Within 7 days, the vibrant energy of the protests dwindled, leaving behind only a faint echo of the clamor that had once filled the streets. One immigration sweep at the event was enough to make others reconsider their presence in the middle of the day. The heavy police presence and the anxiety it caused were palpable. People rushed into stores to buy items while their loved ones kept the car ready in case they needed to speed off. Mal even told me stories of kids exiting stores with one parent to see the other parent being arrested to be shipped off. I was stopped a couple of times for my ID. Each time, the scrutiny in their eyes grew more intense as the days passed. Before I could consider the impact on me, circumstances forced me to reckon with that reality. It was a Tuesday. I remember because nothing came out on Tuesdays. No new movies, no new shows. The day seemed to really drag by each week. As I sat at the dinner table, my fork in mid-twirl through a heap of spaghetti, I just had a feeling something was off. In some ways, it was an average night. My dad wanted rice and beans, but my mom insisted in the opposite direction because you couldn't have rice and beans every night. Dad often won that argument, but today was a win for Mom. Spaghetti it was. With meatballs too, but not the kind either of us liked, since the delivery service subbed out the brand at the last minute. Aside from that, things could be worse. Remember that scene from The Departed, when Mark Wahlberg is just waiting for Matt Damon to come home so he could shoot him? I asked, aiming for a laugh. Nothing. We all loved that scene too. This whole deportation thing was killing the vibe. Mom was mid-sentence, recounting her day with a lightness that only came after she clocked out from work, when the knock came. Maybe it's just me, but ever since I was younger, I felt a tingle at the bottom of my stomach every time a phone call came in. Always felt like I was going to be given terrible news. The first couple of weeks after they passed the resolution, every time a delivery came in, I was certain my stomach would fall out of the bottom. This time, though, I felt nothing. The transition from cozy to tense happened faster than a jump cut in a thriller flick. Everyone exchanged worried glances that said more than words ever could. Dad's chair scraped against the floor with a screech as he rose to his feet. Maybe it's one of those solar salespeople, I offered, my attempt at humor now as thin as the steam rising off our neglected food. But we all knew better. The great deportation surge had turned knocks on doors into harbingers of upheaval, and every family with a story like ours knew the drill. Which was crazy because between the 3 of us, we knew maybe 20 Spanish words. As it was, families like ours. "Sam, can you," Mom began, but her voice trailed off, the words getting lost in the gravity of the moment. She didn't need to finish. The tightening grip on her napkin spoke volumes. I nodded. My throat suddenly became too tight for words. In the movies, there's always that moment when the hero stands up to face the unknown. But let me tell you, no amount of cinematic inspiration prepared you for the real deal. Dad rose from the table, each of his movements measured, as if he were moving through water instead of air. I could almost hear the cogs turning in his head, the calm giving way to a concern that seemed to add weight to his broad shoulders. "Michael," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a plea, wrapped in a single word, but Dad just gave her a small nod. "Stay seated, everyone," he said with a quiet authority, as if this were just another guest arriving late to our dinner party of apprehension. "I'll handle it." He reached the door and paused for what felt like a full minute, but must have been only seconds. The tension hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of spices and fear. Then, with a click that sounded too loud, the door swung open. Standing there, framed by our cheerful yellow doorway, were two agents from the Federal Immigration Unit. They were like dark clouds ushering in a storm, their uniforms rigid and their badges gleaming in the evening light. One would think they were auditioning for the role of ominous silhouettes in some low-budget play, yet here they were, disturbingly real. "Good evening, sir," the taller one said, his voice carrying the kind of practiced detachment you'd expect from someone who's made a career out of being the bearer of bad news. "Can we help you?" Dad asked, towing the line between polite host and defensive patriarch. He stood firm, filling the space in the doorway as if his presence alone could shield us from whatever these messengers of bureaucracy delivered. Their faces remained unreadable, but their eyes darted past Dad, scanning the room behind him, assessing, calculating. It was a look I'd seen before, on the face of every person who ever decided they held power over another. It was the look of a gambler confident in his hand, regardless of the stakes. "May we come in?" the shorter agent asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like a courtesy preamble to an inevitable entry. "Of course," Dad replied, his voice even, but his posture rigid. "But may I ask why?" The agents exchanged a glance that seemed to carry an entire conversation within seconds, and as they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into our home, the shadows crept in with them, swallowing the last remnants of the warmth we had tried so hard to maintain. The lead agent, a man whose silhouette seemed carved from a bureaucratic handbook, stepped closer, his shoes clicking on the hardwood floor like a countdown. "Michael Edward?" he asked, voice devoid of any inflection that might suggest this was more than just another item on his checklist. "Speaking," Dad said, his stance unwavering, an oak in a storm of uncertainty. I was pretty sure he could take them. I was small for a 26-year-old, same as my dad at his age, but he knew how to fight. In his early 20s, he'd been an amateur boxer, and the muscle memory, the stance, the power in his punches all remained. Depending on what family member was telling the story, I'd even heard tale of a little gang trouble back in the day. Harmless, but more than I ever imagined he would be mixed up in. "Mr. Edward, I am Agent Donovan Hayes with the Federal Immigration Unit." Donovan clipped his words, measuring each syllable with precision, as if they were bullets and he was conserving ammunition. "You are served a deportation order under the expanded provisions of Operation Homeland Purity." Dad's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "There must be some misunderstanding. We have documentation proving our legal status." He retreated to the cabinet by the entrance and returned with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. "Here," Dad said, extending the papers towards the agent with a quiet confidence that seemed to echo around the room. The pages contained our life stories in ink and paper. Birth certificates, naturalization documents for my grandpa, a paycheck stub from 10 years ago that we never got rid of. It was a paper trail, meticulously maintained for moments exactly like this. "Everything is in order," he continued, resembling a knight brandishing his shield, ready to defend his family from any strike. "My mother is from Iowa, and my father eventually received his green card." Agent Hayes accepted the folder, flipping through its contents with a practiced indifference that bordered on performance art. His eyes flicked up to meet Dad's for a moment, and the air between them charged with an unspoken dialogue. Years of policy and counter-arguments distilled into a silent standoff. Further review showed fraud in the application for that green card, Donovan said, glancing toward me to make sure I was nice and snug in my position. I wonder how often people threw a punch or two. What fraud? My dad asked. Maybe he said he had a job when he didn't, but it's nothing worth deporting someone over 40 years later. We have our orders, Mr. Edward, Hayes said, handing back the folder, the papers inside now somehow tainted with the chill of formality. We will explain your appeal options in due course. The new laws are clear. I couldn't help but marvel at the way Dad held himself, a tower of strength against the creeping vines of bureaucracy threatening to pull us under. He nodded, accepting the return of our life's paperwork, his hands not even flinching at the cold touch of the manila cover. Your laws don't apply here, Dad said, his voice steady as the foundation of our family home. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but the agent before us might as well have been a statue for all the emotion he showed. Mr. Edward, Agent Hayes responded, voice flat as the tabletop between them. Our jurisdiction is quite clear. He tapped a finger against the manila folder. This isn't personal, it's simply procedure. I watched from my chair, knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the table. The whole scene felt surreal to me, like a movie dream sequence where the main character is in the middle of the ocean and can't grasp for help. But unlike those silver screen moments, there was no swelling music to accompany Dad's stand, just the sound of my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Why not just bash their brains in and make them work for it? The fleeting thought struck me, then vanished, leaving me feeling foolish. Procedure? Dad's eyebrow quirked up, and I could almost hear him thinking, what kind of nonsense is this? But aloud, he said, these are our lives, not some checklist on your clipboard. New laws, Mr. Edward. They're not negotiable, Agent Hayes replied, his tone suggesting he'd rather be watching paint dry than dealing with our little drama. The other agents behind him shifted, their uniforms rustling like leaves in a breeze, a reminder that they were more than just a backdrop to our despair. They were the enforcers of it. I hated the look on each of their faces. Donovan clearly led. The others looked as though they expected a quiz to test their learning from observation. My dad told me stories about the government back in El Salvador, my dad said as he kept his stare down to the folder of documents. Told me how they'd come and take everything under the guise of procedures from the government. Just wait until it comes for you all, I said, unable to contain the anger that created a burning in my stomach. Sam, Dad said without looking at me, his voice a lifeline tossed into the roiling sea of my thoughts. Stay calm. Calm? The word tasted like ash. How could I stay calm when our world was being disassembled by men who looked at us and saw only boxes to be checked off? There had to be something we could do, some cinematic twist to pull at the last minute. But life, it turned out, wasn't much for plot twists. It was a monotonous, predictable series of events, devoid of excitement. Is there nothing that can be done? Dad asked, and though his voice remained controlled, I sensed his desperation to keep his family afloat in a heartless ocean. Mr. Edward, I suggest you prepare your family for what comes next, Agent Hayes said. I noticed his hands didn't shake. Prepare us for what comes next. The phrase echoed in my head. I could see it now. The credits rolling as our family's story faded to black. The audience left to wonder how anyone could find hope in such an ending. But this wasn't a movie, and I couldn't step out of the theater into the comforting glow of a lobby. This was real, and it was happening. Very well, Dad said, and even without looking at him, I knew his jaw was set, his eyes ablaze with the quiet fire that had always defined him. Sam, he said again, and this time I looked up. Our gazes met, and it felt like passing the torch in a relay race we hadn't signed up for. Right. Stay calm, I repeated, the words hollow. Yet there I was, caught in the tightrope walk between anger and the fierce need to protect what was ours. The room, once filled with the comforting sounds of a family dinner, had shifted into an arena where hope wrestled with despair. My mother's voice rose above the fray, a quiver threading through each word as she stood before the agents, her hands shaking like leaves in a storm. "Please," she begged, her eyes welling with tears that threatened to spill over. "This is our home. We've done nothing wrong." Her plea hung in the air, raw and heavy with emotion. I could see the agents' faces, impassive as stone, their expressions unyielding despite the clear anguish written across my mother's face. "In fairness," Donovan began, "this is being delivered to Michael Edward. This does not include a decision for either of the two of you." "But we are one family," my mother responded. I watched my heart sinking as one agent shifted his weight, his gaze cold and detached. "Ma'am, your emotions are understandable, but they do not change the facts." Their indifference was like a physical force, pressing down on us all. My fists clenched at my sides, frustration boiling inside me. Here we were, reduced to begging for compassion from these jackasses, statistics in a report that would never capture the reality that lived behind the numbers. "Sam?" My mother's voice cracked, reaching out for some semblance of solace. But what could I say? What could I do? I wanted to shout, to rage against the system that had invaded our home with its cold logic and colder hearts. But the words caught in my throat, tangled up in a mix of fury and futility. "Well, go on and get out of here," I shouted to the agents. "Sam," my father and mother said in unison. "What?" I snapped back, turning to look back at my mother before returning my glare to the agents. "They did their thing, checked their box, and now they need to get on." "I'm not done here, Sam," my dad said. "I have more questions." At that moment, I knew I had to get out. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension and unspoken fears. Without another word, I turned, my movements hurried and jerky, propelled by an instinctive need to escape the stifling atmosphere. As I pushed through the front door, the cool evening air hit me like a splash of water on my face. I gulped it down, the night's chill a temporary balm to the heat of my anger. The outside world ignored the drama unfolding within our four walls. Streetlights cast pools of light on the sidewalk, and I found myself drawn to them, moving without direction, driven by the restless energy that coursed through me. "Where can we even go from here?" I muttered to no one in particular. I wandered aimlessly, the sounds of the city fading as I walked. I just knew another minute in there, and I would be spending any time I had left in the same country as my dad in a jail. The horrifying realization that I'd left my ID behind, coupled with a distinct aversion to any form of temporary police detention, no matter how unwarranted, solidified my decision to remain in the area. Could you believe that? I had to consider the repercussions of taking a walk to clear my mind. As I leaned against the trunk of an old oak tree, its bark rough beneath my palms, I tried to let the absurdity of it all wash over me. "Hey, River," a familiar voice called out, pulling me back to reality. I looked up to see Dale crossing the street with that lopsided gait of his, a product of one leg being shorter than the other. A quirk you'd only notice if, like me, you grew up watching him try to play basketball in our youth. In his limp, you could see pride, though. He manned the refinery's overnight shift, therefore his presence outside, cigarette in hand, was commonplace. I suppose everyone had a right to the fresh air of the night, but it was still a little disconcerting on the days I got a little high and drove past his house. I would just see the moonlight illuminated a bright cherry light growing and fading with puffs of smoke following shortly after. That was my dog, though. We'd share a drink here or there, occasionally light up a J and enjoy the wind on those cool, windy nights. I didn't know much more about him than his job and where he lived, but what little I knew was all right. Our friendship bordered on transactional in that I don't think we ever relied on the other emotionally. I never once saw him on a date with someone, and it never occurred to me to ask if he was gay. Nothing wrong with it, but kind of wished I asked at one point, just to know for the sake of knowing. I don't think he knew if I had siblings, and I wasn't sure what his favorite food was. Still, we got along well for years, and though I'd never been in his house, I didn't imagine it was some hoarder nightmare or anything. He came across as well put together, and I don't know if I ever seen him upset. Those days, we hung out more than I hung out with just about everyone besides Mal. Though at that time, my relationship with Mal had become strained, filled with unspoken tension and awkward silences. The way she spoke to me had shifted, and it became more difficult to be seen in public with her. I can say that with clarity now, but at the time, the pieces were still being put together in my head. I figured there was something I could work on for myself, and then we'd be good again. Man, what a mess, Dale said as he approached, his eyes mirroring the turmoil that I felt inside. Saw those suits going in. The feds are really putting on a show tonight, huh? You know they select the friendliest one to deliver the news. I shoved my hands into my pockets, shrugging. I can't tell. Fair, he conceded, rubbing the back of his neck. How was work? I requested a transition to another topic. No need in trying to put my struggle on his shoulders. Short-handed, and I don't think it's going to get better with all these bullshit deportations, he answered. Yeah, I replied. Been short at the restaurant too, but there's also been fewer customers too. Evens out, I guess, in my situation. We stood for a second as I glared at the silhouettes in my home's windows, and Dale took longer and longer drags of the smoke. You want to light up a J? He asked as he flicked his cigarette away and went to grab another. Not yet, I said. The reason was obvious. Another long silence ensued between us. I wasn't complaining since it had been so long since I felt a proper cool breeze. Of all the nights for pleasant weather, tonight had to be the night. Look, Sam, Dale said, his tone sobering. Whatever happens, we stick together, yeah? They can't take down every last one of us. That statement alone left me perplexed. Enough so that I forgot about what was happening at my house. What do you have to worry about? I questioned. It hadn't occurred to me that someone named Dale would have any concern. Technically, nothing right now, Dale said, pulling a pack of smokes from his pocket. You think they stop there? They're already talking about going after people who had one grandparent who came here illegally. Mine didn't come from Mexico a generation ago, but my grandpa was a student who overstayed his visa in the 50s. I may be good for now, but it's coming. If I were you, I wouldn't look past them saying you ain't welcome here since your dad is technically illegal now, too. They just haven't gotten around to the two-step yet. That's crazy, was all I could muster. The thought had crossed my mind more than once, but hearing it aloud sent chills across my body. The night stretched on around us, a backdrop to our dark comedy, punctuated by the muffled sounds of dissent from within my home. Dale and I stood there, two friends bound by the shared surrealism of our times. Eventually, he pulled out a J and lit it without asking me my thoughts on the process. That first puff sent a wave of relaxation from my head to the tips of my toes. Thanks, D, I said, rubbing the back of my neck where tension had set up camp. It's like they've got a problem against common sense. Common sense left the building with Elvis, Dale replied, hands shoved deep into his pockets as he looked at me with eyes that held storms of their own. You know, when I watched those old dystopian movies, I never thought I'd end up living in one. But here we are, casting for 1984, the reality show. Starring Sam, the hero, Dale joked, but his attempt at humor couldn't mask the gravity of the moment. More like man in coffee shop number 2, I corrected him. The laugh that followed was hollow, more reflex than mirth. How did it come to this, dog? When did the American dream become a choose-your-own-adventure book where all the endings suck? Politics happened, Dale muttered darkly. They turned fear into a party platform. Guess what? Game over, I said, clenching my fists. I'm not going to stand by and watch them tear my family apart. Count me in, he said, without hesitation. And hey, if we're going down, we might as well go down swinging, right? Swinging, kicking, screaming, the whole 9 yards, Dale agreed, offering a grim smile. This is our dirt, Sam. Don't you forget that. This is our dirt, I repeated back. I talked a big game, but there wasn't much in me that even considered the option of taking a pipe to one of the agents. The law, and the country with it, had spoken, and you were required to follow the law. It's what made the best countries the best, and it's what eluded the worst countries. On top of that, I was just one person. My family was just 3 people, and even with Dale, we were 4 of us. At best, we were a penny on a railroad track about to be smashed to nothing by the incoming load. They'd really done it smart. To ensure fairness, law enforcement initially focused on known criminals. It was difficult to argue against that. Who wanted more criminals in their country? But that just meant a little less resistance of the next phase. Most annoying was I had to lump myself in with the immigrants now. I was born here, in Houston. I think on a Tuesday. So stupid. What the agents were saying to my dad inside our living room was as relevant to me and Dale as it was to someone fresh over the border. We stood side by side, 2 figures carved from the night, our shadows stretching back toward the house that no longer felt like a sanctuary. Inside, the agents continued their methodical work, oblivious to the lives they were uprooting. Whatever happens next, it is going to be interesting, I said. Damn straight, Dale replied, and there was steel in his voice now, the kind forged in the fires of adversity. As the night gathered around us, I felt the weight of the world bearing down, the future uncertain and fraught with peril. I was going to figure something out. I had to. I wouldn't be like all those people who saw this coming a mile away and proceeded to do nothing. I wasn't an ordinary immigrant. I was an American, and this country, with its sights, sounds, and smells, was where I belonged. The defiant urge to tell the government to back off pulsed through my very being. I was, and forever would be, of this country, and there was nothing that would take that away from me.